The demolition crew thought they were tearing down old brick and rotten timber. Instead, they uncovered human bones buried beneath the floor of a Victorian prison. Shackled, forgotten, and hidden for more than a century, what archaeologists would eventually reveal inside that jail would reopen questions about justice, punishment, and the brutal reality of 19th century incarceration in Britain. Before we step inside the darkness, make sure you subscribe, like, and leave your thoughts below, because the deeper we go into this prison's past, the more disturbing the truth becomes. The first call came in early 2018, just after sunrise, at a redevelopment site in the historic city of Lincoln. Contractors were working on the grounds of the former Lincoln Castle, a medieval fortress that had doubled as a Victorian prison for much of the 19th century. The site was being carefully prepared for restoration and expansion, nothing unusual for a location layered with centuries of history. But then a mechanical digger scraped across something that wasn't stone. The operator stopped immediately. Workers climbed down into the trench. What they saw protruding from the soil wasn't debris. It was curved, pale, fragile, a human skull. Within hours, the site was sealed off. Police officers secured the perimeter, unsure whether they were dealing with a modern crime scene or something much older. The skull was partially intact. Nearby, fragments of ribs and long bones were visible in the earth. There were no visible coffins, no grave markers, just bones, lying beneath what had once been the prison exercise yard. The location made everything more unsettling. This wasn't an abandoned cemetery. This was the grounds of a former Victorian jail, a place that once held hundreds of men, women, and even children under harsh 19th century penal laws. Archaeologists from the University of Sheffield were brought in to examine the discovery. Their initial assessment shifted the case from active homicide to historical investigation. The bones, they concluded, were likely more than a century old. What no one expected was how many more bodies would surface. As excavation continued, skeletal remains began emerging in clusters. Some were buried individually, others appeared stacked in shallow graves. In total, archaeologists would uncover the remains of dozens of prisoners beneath the prison yard, individuals who had died while incarcerated in the Victorian era and were buried on site. But one detail caught immediate attention. Several skeletons still bore iron restraints, leg irons, shackles, corroded but unmistakable. These were not ceremonial burials. These were incarcerated men and women laid to rest, still bound in chains. To understand why, investigators turned back the clock to the 19th century. The Victorian prison at Lincoln Castle opened in the 1840s during a period of sweeping reform in Britain's penal system. It was designed under the separate system regime intended to isolate prisoners completely. Inmates lived, worked, and worshipped alone, separated even during chapel services by high wooden partitions. Silence was mandatory. Eye contact was forbidden. Communication meant punishment. Prisoners spent up to 23 hours a day in narrow cells. Exercise took place in circular yards where inmates walked alone, each confined to a wedge-shaped segment, unable to see the others. The goal was moral reform through solitude. In practice, it often resulted in psychological breakdown. Records show that between 1848 and 1878, dozens of inmates died at Lincoln Prison. Causes ranged from tuberculosis to malnutrition, infectious disease, and what was then vaguely described as exhaustion. In the 19th century, if a prisoner died behind bars, the body was rarely returned to family. Instead, the deceased were buried within prison grounds unmarked and documented beyond basic ledgers. The excavation team began cross-referencing burial positions with archival prison death records. The names emerged slowly from faded ink on brittle pages. Men convicted of theft, women imprisoned for vagrancy, teenagers sentenced for petty crimes that today might warrant community service. One of the earliest identified names was John Claxton, recorded as dying in custody in 1850 at age 32. Cause of death: pulmonary disease. Another was Sarah Brown, aged 19, imprisoned for stealing clothing and listed as deceased after just 6 months inside. Each skeleton became more than bone. It became a person, But then archaeologists made a more troubling observation. Some graves appeared hurried. Bodies were placed without coffins. In a few cases, skeletons were positioned face down. There were inconsistencies between the number of recorded deaths and the number of remains being uncovered. That discrepancy raised a quiet but powerful question. Were all these burials properly documented? Victorian prisons were notorious for overcrowding and disease outbreaks. During periods of epidemic, deaths could spike rapidly. Historical records from other prisons in Britain reveal instances where mortality rates surged during cholera and influenza outbreaks. Yet the burial patterns at Lincoln seemed more chaotic than expected. Dr. Hugh Wilmot, the lead archaeologist, later explained that the presence of leg irons on some skeletons was particularly significant. It suggested that certain prisoners were buried directly from confinement, possibly without removal of restraints. Why would that happen? One possibility was practicality. Removing iron restraints from a corpse required time and manpower. During periods of multiple deaths, staff may have buried inmates quickly to prevent disease spread. But another theory lingered in the background. Punishment extended beyond death. Some Victorian authorities believed that criminals did not deserve dignified burial rites. There was no evidence of violence on the bones, no fractures suggesting execution or physical assault at the time of death. Still, the imagery was stark. Human beings lowered into the earth, still chained. As news of the discovery spread, public reaction intensified. Media outlets across the UK reported on prisoner skeletons found in chains. For many, it was a chilling reminder of how different justice once looked. Descendants of former inmates began contacting historians, searching for information about relatives who had disappeared into the prison system more than 150 years earlier. The excavation expanded. By the end of the dig, archaeologists had uncovered 58 skeletons in total. Careful osteological analysis revealed signs of hard labor. Several skeletons showed spinal stress injuries consistent with repetitive physical work, likely the prison treadmill, a grueling punishment device used in Victorian jails. Prisoners were forced to climb rotating steps for hours, generating energy while enduring exhaustion. Malnutrition markers appeared in bone development patterns. Dental analysis suggested poor diet even before incarceration, indicating many inmates had lived in poverty long before their crimes. What emerged was not a story of notorious killers. It was a portrait of 19th-century social inequality. Most prisoners at Lincoln were convicted of minor non-violent offenses: theft of bread, petty fraud, public drunkenness. In the harsh legal climate of Victorian England, such crimes could result in years of imprisonment. The burial ground beneath the prison yard told a silent story of systemic hardship. Yet as methodical as the investigation appeared, one final discovery shifted the tone once again. Toward the edge of the excavation site, archaeologists uncovered a burial that differed from the rest. The skeleton was laid slightly apart from the cluster. The body had been interred deeper, and unlike many others, this individual's grave contained remnants of a wooden coffin. Iron restraints were present, but they were heavier, more substantial than standard leg irons. Archival records showed that only one prisoner during that period had been categorized as dangerous and violent and held under enhanced restraints before death. His name was recorded in prison logs as William Hardy. Convicted of a brutal assault in 1856, Hardy had reportedly caused significant injury during a robbery. Newspaper clippings from the time described public outrage and a swift conviction. He died in prison just 2 years later under what was vaguely described as sudden illness, but there were no medical details. No coroner's report attached to his entry. Why was he buried differently? Why the heavier restraints? And why did official documentation surrounding his death seem incomplete compared to others? As archaeologists carefully lifted his remains for analysis, one detail became impossible to ignore. There were subtle marks along the cervical vertebrae, marks that did not immediately match the recorded cause of death. And when forensic specialists took a closer look, they realized the official story from 1858 might not tell the full truth. The Victorian prison yard had already given up its secrets, but William Hardy's bones were about to challenge the historical record itself. When the initial osteological report on William Hardy came back, the room fell silent. The cervical vertebrae, the delicate bones of the neck, showed signs of trauma, not the kind associated with disease, not the gradual deterioration of illness. The markings suggested force, compression, possibly strangulation, yet the prison ledger from 1858 recorded his cause of death as sudden fever. The discrepancy forced historians and forensic specialists to dig deeper, not into the soil this time, but into the archives. Lincoln Prison in the mid-19th century operated under strict discipline. Hardy's name appeared frequently in disciplinary logs during his incarceration. Entries described him as insubordinate, violent toward staff, and once placed in restraints following disturbance. One notation stood out: solitary confinement extended beyond standard duration. At the time, prolonged isolation was already known to cause severe psychological distress. Official policy limited how long an inmate could be held under such conditions. Yet Hardy's record suggested multiple consecutive extensions. Dr. Hugh Wilmot and his team began comparing Hardy's burial to the others uncovered beneath the yard at Lincoln Castle. Most prisoners were interred in simple, shallow graves aligned in rows. Hardy's grave was offset, deeper, more deliberate, and the heavier restraints on his legs were unlike any others recovered from the site. If Hardy died of fever, why was he still shackled in reinforced irons? The answer wasn't in the burial ground. It was in the administrative silence that followed his death. Researchers turned to local newspaper archives from Lincoln. Victorian papers were often detailed, especially regarding violent offenders. Hardy's trial had been covered extensively in 1856. Headlines described him as a dangerous character. The victim of his assault survived, but the brutality had stirred public fear. Yet when Hardy died 2 years later, there was no obituary, no court report, no coroner's summary. In 19th century England, sudden deaths in custody were typically subject to inquests. These proceedings were recorded and often reported publicly, but no inquest record for Hardy could be located in the county archives. The absence became its own clue. Forensic analysis of Hardy's remains continued. There were no defensive fractures in the arms or hands, no skull trauma, but the neck told a different story. The pattern of damage suggested pressure applied from behind or from the side. While the passage of more than 150 years made absolute conclusions impossible, experts agreed on one point: the injury was inconsistent with death from fever. Historians began examining prison practices of the era more broadly. Victorian prisons were designed around discipline and deterrence. Corporal punishment had officially declined by the mid-1800s, but control measures remained harsh. Prisoners who resisted authority could be subjected to restraint chairs, dark cells, and extended isolation. There were documented cases in other British institutions where excessive restraint led to fatalities. Not always intentional, sometimes the result of overzealous enforcement, sometimes concealed to avoid scandal. Could Hardy's death have resulted from an altercation with guards? One overlooked ledger entry added fuel to the theory. 3 days before Hardy's recorded death, a notation mentioned incident in corridor, staff involved. No further details were provided. The handwriting was hurried, the ink darker, as though written under pressure. Archaeologists weren't conducting a murder investigation in the modern legal sense. There was no one left to prosecute, but they were reconstructing truth from fragments: bone, iron, ink. Meanwhile, public interest intensified. News reports framed the discovery as a window into Victorian justice. Families of former prisoners expressed a mixture of sorrow and validation. For decades, the harshness of 19th century incarceration had been discussed in abstract terms. Now, there was physical evidence beneath the soil. The University of Sheffield team expanded its review beyond Hardy. Of the 58 skeletons uncovered, several showed signs of respiratory disease, consistent with tuberculosis common in overcrowded prisons. Others displayed malnutrition markers. One skeleton, identified as a teenage boy through dental and skeletal development, likely died before reaching adulthood. His prison record listed him as 16 years old, convicted of stealing food. The emotional weight of the excavation grew heavier with each identification, but Hardy remained the anomaly. Researchers consulted experts in Victorian legal history. In the 1850s, prison authorities were under increasing scrutiny. Reformers argued that excessive punishment undermined the stated goal of rehabilitation. If a prisoner had died during a violent confrontation with staff, administrators would have had strong incentive to minimize public exposure. Covering a custodial death as illness was not unprecedented, yet speculation required caution. There was no surviving eyewitness account, no confession, only circumstantial evidence and skeletal indicators. Still, patterns matter. Hardy's reinforced shackles suggested he had been considered a high-risk inmate even at the time of burial. That detail alone contradicted the idea of a quiet, feverish death in bed. And then another document surfaced. While examining Home Office correspondence stored in regional archives, a historian discovered a letter dated months after Hardy's death. It referenced concerns regarding disciplinary excess at Lincoln Prison. The letter did not name Hardy directly, but it mentioned recent events that required internal review. There was no record of what that review concluded. The discovery didn't prove homicide. It did, however, reveal administrative tension during the period in question. Archaeologists shared their findings transparently. They avoided sensational conclusions. Official statements emphasized that while trauma to Hardy's neck was evident, determining exact cause of death after so many years remained challenging. Yet in the court of public opinion, the narrative shifted. What if one of the skeletons beneath the prison yard represented not just harsh imprisonment, but a concealed custodial death? The question cast a long shadow over the otherwise methodical excavation. Meanwhile, restoration work at Lincoln Castle continued around the carefully protected dig site. Tourists walking the medieval walls above had little idea that beneath their feet, investigators were piecing together fragments of forgotten lives. The Victorian prison system had been built to enforce silence, literal silence among inmates, and institutional silence in records. The separate system prevented prisoners from speaking to one another. Deaths were logged clinically. Burials were unmarked. The earth had preserved what bureaucracy had obscured. In late 2018, after months of analysis, Hardy's remains and those of the other prisoners were respectfully reinterred in a formal ceremony. Clergy, historians, and local officials attended. Names were read aloud where known. A memorial plaque was installed acknowledging the individuals who had died within the prison walls. It was an act of recognition long overdue. But even as the remains were laid to rest again, the unanswered question lingered. If Hardy's death had indeed resulted from excessive force, it would represent more than an isolated incident. It would reflect a systemic environment where oversight was limited and accountability scarce. And there was one final detail that kept investigators unsettled. Among the disciplinary logs from 1858, the names of 2 prison officers repeatedly appeared alongside Hardy's infractions. Both men left their posts within months of his death. Their departure records cited transfer of service, yet no subsequent employment within the prison system could be traced. Why did they leave so abruptly? There was no direct evidence tying them to wrongdoing, but the timing was difficult to ignore. The excavation at Lincoln Castle had begun as a routine archaeological survey. It had evolved into a historical reckoning. By the time the excavation beneath Lincoln Castle officially concluded, the soil had given up 58 lives. Each skeleton had been catalogued, examined, measured, and compared against 19th-century prison records. Ages were estimated, sex determined, signs of illness documented. Where possible, names were matched to bones, but William Hardy remained the most unsettling figure in the yard. In the final phase of analysis, forensic specialists revisited the trauma on his cervical vertebrae. They consulted comparative cases, modern forensic literature on neck injuries, historical studies on restraint-related fatalities, and documented Victorian-era disciplinary practices. The damage to Hardy's neck was consistent with forceful compression. However, there were limitations. Soil pressure over more than 150 years can alter bone. Decomposition complicates interpretation. Absolute certainty was impossible. The official conclusion, carefully worded, stated that the trauma was not inconsistent with force applied to the neck, but that cause of death could not be definitively determined. For some, that sounded cautious. For historians, it was significant, because Hardy's prison record, unlike others, lacked the typical medical detail attached to deaths from infectious disease. Tuberculosis cases often described lingering symptoms. Cholera deaths were recorded during outbreaks. Even malnutrition-related fatalities had notes referencing decline. Hardy's entry was brief. Sudden fever, no elaboration. When researchers completed their archival review in Lincoln, they published their findings through academic channels. The interpretation was restrained but clear. The burial ground reflected harsh prison conditions, social inequality, and a penal system operating with minimal transparency. In Hardy's case, questions remained unanswered, but the larger story extended beyond one man. Osteological analysis across the 58 skeletons painted a grim portrait of Victorian incarceration. Many showed rib lesions consistent with chronic respiratory disease. Several skeletons exhibited spinal compression and joint degeneration, likely caused by repetitive labor, including time spent on the prison treadmill, a device used in British jails as a form of punishment and energy generation. Malnutrition markers appeared in younger inmates. Enamel hypoplasia on teeth indicated childhood stress and poor diet long before imprisonment. In other words, many of these prisoners entered Lincoln Prison already vulnerable. The crimes recorded in the prison ledger were often minor by modern standards: theft of food, pickpocketing, forgery of small sums. For women, charges frequently included vagrancy or prostitution-related offenses, crimes rooted in poverty more than violence. The excavation forced historians to confront a stark truth. Victorian prisons like Lincoln were not filled primarily with hardened criminals. They were filled with the poor, and when those inmates died, they were buried where they fell beneath the very institution that confined them. The final report emphasized that burial within prison grounds was common practice in 19th century Britain. Families were not always notified promptly. Transportation of bodies cost money. Administrative efficiency often outweighed ceremony, yet the presence of restraints on several skeletons remained one of the most haunting images to emerge from the dig. Leg irons were typically removed upon death. Their presence suggested either haste or indifference. In Hardy's case, the heavier shackles indicated he was still classified as dangerous at the time of burial. Historians explored another possibility. Victorian prisons operated under intense pressure to maintain order. A violent altercation resulting in an inmate's death could have sparked public backlash. If Hardy had resisted, and force had been applied excessively, administrators may have chosen to attribute his death to illness rather than admit misconduct. There was no surviving confession, no witness testimony preserved in ink, only absence, and absence, in historical investigation, can be as telling as evidence. The two prison officers whose names appeared repeatedly in Hardy's disciplinary entries remained shadows in the record. Their departure from Lincoln Prison shortly after Hardy's death was documented, but not explained. Efforts to trace them through other prison registers yielded nothing conclusive. Did they leave because of routine transfers? Or because of scrutiny? The answer may never be known. In late 2018, after extensive study, the remains were prepared for reburial. A ceremony was held within the castle grounds. Clergy led prayers. Local officials spoke about remembrance. A memorial plaque was installed to acknowledge the individuals who died while incarcerated in the Victorian prison. For the first time, the burial site was marked. Names that had once existed only in faded ledgers were read aloud in public. It was not a criminal trial. It was not a courtroom revelation. There were no arrests. But it was accountability in another form: the restoration of identity. The excavation at Lincoln Castle did not uncover evidence of a serial killer or a hidden mass execution. It uncovered something quieter and, in many ways, more unsettling: systemic hardship preserved in bone. The twist was not a shocking modern crime. The twist was this: what began as a construction delay became a confrontation with how justice once operated. The Victorian prison system was built on silence. Silence in cells, silence in records, silence in burial, more than 150 years later, that silence was broken by accident by a machine cutting into earth, and beneath layers of brick and soil, the past was waiting. William Hardy's death may never be definitively explained. The trauma to his neck will always exist in a gray space between certainty and possibility. But the excavation changed the historical narrative. It forced scholars to reconsider how custodial deaths were recorded. It highlighted the vulnerability of incarcerated populations in 19th century Britain, and it reminded the public that progress in justice systems often comes at the cost of confronting uncomfortable truths. The bones beneath Lincoln Castle did not scream, they did not accuse, they simply endured until someone listened. Today, visitors walking through the restored Victorian prison at Lincoln Castle can see preserved cells, narrow corridors, and the chapel partitions that once kept inmates isolated from one another. They can stand in the exercise yard and imagine rows of prisoners pacing alone. But now, they also know what lies beneath. The memorial ensures that the individuals buried there are no longer anonymous. In the end, the most powerful revelation was not about a single suspicious death. It was about recognition. For more than a century, these men and women existed only as numbers in a ledger. Now, they are part of documented history, studied, acknowledged, and remembered. And that may be the most profound form of justice available so long after the fact. If this story changed the way you see the past, share your thoughts below. Do you believe William Hardy's death was concealed? Or was it truly illness as recorded? Conversations like this keep history alive. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into real cases that still echo today.